On January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, one of the most famous British generals of World War II, held a press conference at his headquarters in Belgium. This was not an ordinary event. Montgomery had decided to call the reporters himself because he wanted to explain his side of the story about the recent fighting in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge, which had just taken place, was one of the largest and most dangerous battles of the war. The German army had launched a sudden and powerful attack, and many people were confused about who had done what to stop it. Montgomery wanted to make sure that everyone understood his role. Montgomery entered the room wearing his usual beret. On the beret were two badges showing his rank and honors. He looked calm and confident, almost as if he were relaxed, even though the situation was tense. The room was full of reporters from Britain and America. They were carrying notebooks and pens, ready to write down every word. Most of them thought this press conference would be a normal military update. They expected numbers about enemy losses, territory gained, or progress made by the Allies. But what Montgomery said was not what anyone expected. Instead of a normal briefing, his words caused a huge storm. Within just one day, General Omar Bradley, the senior American general, began thinking about resigning. 2 days later, Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was forced to act quickly to prevent a serious crisis between Britain and America. And within a week, the entire command structure of the Allied forces in Europe was facing one of the biggest challenges of the war. Leaders who had worked together smoothly were now questioning each other. Trust was shaken, and the stability of the Allied effort was in danger. What started as a simple press conference by Montgomery had turned into a moment that could have changed the course of the war. Every word he spoke, every detail he revealed, sent shockwaves through the military and political leaders of the Allies. It was a reminder that even in war, words could be as powerful as weapons, and a single speech could threaten to unravel months, even years of careful planning. To really understand what happened at that famous press conference, we first need to know what was happening on the battlefield at the time. This means looking at the Battle of the Bulge, one of the most intense and dramatic battles of World War II. The battle began on December 16, 1944. This was when Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, launched his last major attack in the western part of Europe. He wanted to turn the war around and break through the Allied lines. In this attack, he sent 29 German divisions, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, into the Ardennes, a forested region of Belgium and Luxembourg. The German attack was a complete surprise. The American soldiers who were stationed there were not expecting it. Many of the American positions were weak and unprepared for such a sudden assault. The Germans managed to smash through these defenses and pushed very far into the Allied lines, about 60 miles in some areas. This was an incredible distance, and it caused panic because the Germans were now threatening to capture Antwerp, one of the most important ports that the Allies used to bring in food, fuel, weapons, and other supplies. In the first 2 days of the attack, entire American divisions were either surrounded by German forces or forced to retreat. There was chaos everywhere. Soldiers were fighting desperately in freezing temperatures, in heavy snow, and through thick fog. Communication was difficult, reinforcements were delayed, and leaders struggled to understand what was happening. The battle lasted for about 6 weeks, and it became the largest and bloodiest battle that the United States Army fought during the entire war. By the end of it, the Americans had suffered over 89,000 casualties, including those killed, wounded, or missing. The first days of the battle were especially terrifying and confusing, as soldiers fought for survival against a powerful and determined enemy in some of the harshest winter conditions imaginable. Understanding this chaos helps explain why Montgomery's press conference just a few weeks later caused so much tension. The Americans were still recovering from shock, losses, and confusion, and the details Montgomery revealed added fuel to an already tense situation between the Allied leaders. On December 20, 1944, Just 4 days after the Germans had launched their massive offensive in the Ardennes, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a very difficult and controversial decision. By this point, the German attack had created a bulge in the Allied lines, splitting the American front in two. This meant that communication between the Northern and Southern American forces had become almost impossible. Messages were slow, confusing, and sometimes did not reach the right commanders on time. The situation on the ground was chaotic, and the Allies needed a quick solution to stop the German advance. Eisenhower decided that, for the moment, it would be best to place all Allied forces north of the German penetration under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the famous British general. This was not a small decision. It meant that two major American armies, the U.S. First Army, led by General Courtney Hodges, and the U.S. Ninth Army, led by General William Simpson, would now answer to a British commander. Until this point, both of these armies had been under the direct command of General Omar Bradley. Bradley had led them since the Normandy invasion in June 1944, and he had grown very familiar with their strengths, weaknesses, and leaders. When Eisenhower told Bradley about this change, Bradley was furious. He felt that the command of his armies had been taken away from him unfairly. He had worked hard to lead and coordinate these forces through months of intense fighting, and suddenly they were being given to someone he did not fully trust. Bradley distrusted Montgomery, the British general, and he resented being forced to give up control of the armies he had commanded for so long. This decision, while intended to help the Allies respond more effectively to the German attack, immediately caused tension between the American and British commanders and added another layer of stress to an already dangerous situation. This moment would later be seen as one of the most controversial command decisions of the Battle of the Bulge. While it may have helped stop the German advance, it also deepened personal and professional rivalries between some of the most powerful leaders in the Allied forces. General Omar Bradley did not accept Eisenhower's decision quietly. He argued strongly and passionately against it. Bradley believed that the communication problems between the Northern and Southern American forces were only temporary and could be managed without making such a drastic change. He was convinced that placing American armies under the command of a British general would send the wrong message, not just to the soldiers on the front lines, but also to the American public and political leaders back home. In his view, it would look like a vote of no confidence in American leadership, a public humiliation for the commanders who had been fighting bravely for months. Bradley warned Eisenhower that the decision could be politically explosive. He knew that if word got out, many Americans would question the competence of their own generals. It could damage the reputation of the U.S. Army at a critical moment in the war. Eisenhower, however, was firm. He overruled Bradley's objections. He said the decision was necessary for operational reasons. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern sector of the front, and Eisenhower believed that Montgomery could coordinate the defense more effectively from that position. In other words, Eisenhower wanted to make sure the Allied forces could respond quickly to the German advance, and he thought Montgomery was the best person to make that happen. Bradley understood the practical reasoning, but he also saw the situation for what it really looked like. American forces had been hit hard by a sudden German attack. They had been surprised, thrown into chaos, and forced to fight desperately in freezing winter conditions. And now, from the outside, it appeared that a British general was being brought in to fix the problem. To many observers, it could look like the Americans were unable to handle their own armies, which was exactly the kind of humiliation Bradley had feared. He knew that even if the decision helped militarily, it could create tensions, mistrust, and resentment among the Allied commanders and make an already dangerous situation even more complicated. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery arrived at the headquarters of General Courtney Hodges' First Army on December 20, 1944. He came like a man stepping in to rescue a ship that was already taking on water. The situation on the northern part of the front was extremely difficult. Montgomery later described what he found as a scene of complete disorganization and confusion. According to him, American commanders did not even know where all their units were, and communication between the different divisions was chaotic. Montgomery's chief of staff also wrote about the situation, saying that General Hodges himself appeared exhausted and uncertain. The stress of the German attack had taken a heavy toll. Soldiers were scattered, units were mixed up, and the defensive lines were under severe pressure. It was clear that immediate action was needed to prevent the German advance from becoming even more dangerous. Montgomery quickly began to reorganize the defense. He made decisions to pull back some American units, placing them in stronger, more defensible positions. At the same time, he prepared reserves to launch counterattacks where they might be needed most. He also coordinated the movement of the British 30 Corps, which was positioned behind the American lines as a strategic reserve. This meant that fresh, well-prepared troops were ready to support the Americans and push back the German forces. To be fair, Montgomery did a competent job. Under his leadership, the northern shoulder of the Bulge began to stabilize. Units were placed more effectively, reserves were ready, and coordination improved. His presence brought a sense of organization and control to a chaotic situation. The defense under Montgomery's command was stronger than it had been before, and he helped ensure that the German advance could no longer easily push through the Allied lines. Even though tensions existed between the American and British commanders, Montgomery's efforts did contribute to stopping the German offensive in the north. His arrival brought order to confusion, and his planning gave the Allies the structure they needed to fight back effectively. While Montgomery played an important role in organizing the northern defense, the real hero of the Battle of the Bulge was General George S. Patton. Patton was the commander of the U.S. Third Army, and he became famous during this battle for one of the most extraordinary military maneuvers in history. The German attack had started on December 16, 1944, and by December 19, just 3 days later, the situation was still very dangerous. Patton realized that immediate action was needed to stop the German advance and save the American forces that were trapped. He made a bold and difficult decision. He ordered 3 entire divisions of his Third Army to disengage from their current positions. Then he turned them almost completely around, about 90 degrees, to face north toward the German southern flank. This was no easy task. The soldiers had to march about 100 miles through harsh winter weather. There was snow, ice, and freezing temperatures, and yet Patton's army moved quickly and efficiently. His goal was to strike the Germans from the south, relieving the pressure on the American forces that were fighting in the Ardennes forest. By December 26th, Patton's forces had reached Bastogne, a town that had been surrounded by the Germans for days. His arrival relieved the 101st Airborne Division, which had been holding out heroically but was in desperate need of reinforcements, food, and supplies. This dramatic maneuver boosted the morale of the American soldiers and turned the tide of the battle. By early January 1945, Patton's Third Army was pushing into the German Bulge from the south, while General Hodges' First Army, now reorganized under Montgomery, attacked from the north. The German forces found themselves trapped between 2 powerful American armies, facing attacks from both directions. By January 3rd, it was clear that the German offensive had failed. The Wehrmacht, the German army, was in retreat, and the crisis that had threatened to destabilize the Allied lines for weeks was finally over. The bold moves of Patton, combined with the defensive efforts in the north, had crushed the German attack and restored stability to the front. The Battle of the Bulge, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of World War II, was finally won. After the Battle of the Bulge was over and the German offensive had been stopped, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery made a surprising decision. He decided that he needed to hold a press conference. Montgomery told his staff that he wanted to clarify what had really happened during the battle. He wanted to correct misunderstandings and give credit where it was due. He also wanted the British people to understand the important role their forces had played in stopping the German attack. Montgomery's staff was worried about this idea. They warned him that the Americans were very sensitive about the situation. They knew that tensions had already been high between Montgomery and the American generals, and they feared that any public statements could make those tensions worse. His staff suggested that Montgomery should leave public explanations to Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, who was the overall commander of all Allied forces in Europe. They believed that Eisenhower was the right person to speak to the press and avoid creating friction. But Montgomery ignored their advice. He believed strongly that he needed to speak for himself. He was determined to make his own version of events known and to highlight the role of British forces. He carefully prepared his notes and thought about exactly what he wanted to say. He planned to set the record straight and make sure that the story of the battle reflected his perspective. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery stood in front of the press. Reporters from Britain, America, and other Allied countries filled the room, ready to hear the usual military updates. Montgomery, calm and confident, began speaking. He was prepared, focused, and determined. What he said that day would shock many people and have serious consequences for the relationship between the British and American commanders. The press conference was not just a routine briefing, it was a moment that would test alliances, challenge leadership, and send ripples through the highest levels of command. When Montgomery began speaking at the press conference, he first talked about the German offensive and explained how he had been given command of the northern part of the front. At first, the reporters listened politely, expecting a standard military briefing. But then Montgomery said something that made the American correspondents sit up straighter and pay close attention. He said, "The battle has been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled." Those words caught everyone off guard. He was not talking about the American generals or their actions. He did not say that the battle had been interesting for the troops on the ground or for General Hodges or anyone else. He said it had been interesting for him, Montgomery. He was taking credit for what had happened, not the American commanders, not the troops themselves, but Montgomery. He continued speaking in the first person, describing exactly what he had done to organize the battle. He explained how he had tidied up the battle area and gotten things under control. He talked about how he had positioned the American forces, organized reserves, and prepared counterattacks. Every detail he gave was about his own actions and decisions. The reporters could sense the tone. Montgomery was not just giving a factual account of the battle, he was highlighting himself as the person who had saved the day in the northern sector. It was unusual, even shocking, to hear a commander describe the actions of an entire battle entirely in terms of what he personally had accomplished. The Americans in the room felt uneasy, because Montgomery's words seemed to imply that without him, the situation might have been hopeless.
Montgomery continued speaking, pausing occasionally to clear his throat as he emphasized his points. He said, "I took certain steps myself to make sure that if the Germans reached the Meuse River, they would certainly not be able to cross it. I deployed all the available power of the British group of armies, and finally it was put into battle with a bang." Here, Montgomery was describing the British forces as the decisive factor in stopping the Germans. His words were carefully chosen to highlight the importance of the British troops. The American reporters in the room immediately noticed this. They began writing faster, sensing that what Montgomery was saying was going to be controversial. He continued, "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. This power was brought into play very gradually, in a way that would not interfere with the American lines of communication. Finally, it was used with a bang, and today British divisions are fighting hard on the right flank of the 1st U.S. Army." Montgomery painted a picture in which British troops were now on both sides of the American forces. According to him, the Americans had suffered a hard blow, and the British had stepped in to save the situation. You have, thus, he said, the picture of British troops fighting on both sides of American forces who have been hit hard. This is a fine Allied picture. The reporters could feel the tension in the room. Montgomery's words suggested that without the British forces, and by implication, without him personally, the Americans might not have been able to hold the line. To many in the American press, this came across as diminishing the role of the U.S. Army in the battle. Montgomery's tone and phrasing made it clear that he saw the British troops under his command as the decisive element in turning the tide. It was a statement that was factual in some ways, but politically explosive.
The American reporters in the room understood immediately what Montgomery was implying. According to him, the Americans had suffered a severe blow in the Battle of the Bulge. They had struggled to hold the line, and they could not handle the situation on their own. So, Montgomery suggested, the British commander, himself, had stepped in, organized the chaotic battle area, deployed British forces to protect the Americans, and ultimately saved the situation. To put this in perspective, American soldiers had spent 6 weeks fighting desperately in freezing snow and harsh winter conditions. They had held their positions against overwhelming German attacks, enduring unimaginable hardship and heavy casualties. And now Montgomery was publicly claiming that it was his leadership and the British troops under him that had rescued the Americans. Montgomery continued, saying, "The battle has been a great Allied victory. I think the operations to seal off the salient now being carried out are being very well handled by General Bradley." In other words, he acknowledged Bradley's role, but only after he had sorted everything out himself. Then a reporter asked about General George Patton and his famous maneuver to relieve Bastogne. Montgomery's response was brief and dismissive. "Patton has done very well indeed," he said, offering only a small acknowledgment before quickly returning to describing his own decisions and troop movements. The American reporters were growing more uncomfortable with every word. From their perspective, Montgomery was minimizing the role of American generals and soldiers, while presenting himself and the British forces as the real heroes of the battle. Meanwhile, the British press loved the press conference. Montgomery's careful emphasis on British contributions, his confident tone, and his portrayal of decisive leadership created a story that was compelling and flattering to British audiences. For them, Montgomery had handled a crisis with skill and brilliance. But for Americans, the event was infuriating. It suggested that without Montgomery, the U.S. Army might have failed, and it ignored the immense sacrifices and heroism of American soldiers and commanders. After Montgomery's press conference, the reaction in Britain was immediate and enthusiastic. The London newspapers ran bold headlines claiming that Montgomery had saved the Americans. One headline read, "Monty clears up the mess," while another proclaimed, "British General rescues Yanks." British correspondents wrote stories emphasizing the same point. When the Americans ran into trouble, they had to rely on a British general to come in and fix the situation. Montgomery was portrayed as the experienced professional soldier who had stepped in to save the amateurs. The tone of these articles was triumphant and even a little gloating. For the British public, exhausted by 5 years of war and often feeling overshadowed by their powerful American allies, the news was exhilarating. They eagerly embraced Montgomery as a hero once again, much as they had after his successes in earlier campaigns, like in El Alamein. The stories suggested that the British, under Montgomery's leadership, had shown the Americans how it was really done. Montgomery's press conference and the ensuing headlines gave him a reputation at home as the general who had saved the day. For many in Britain, he was not just a commander, he was a symbol of British strength and skill in a war dominated by the enormous American military effort. The narrative painted a clear picture. The Americans had struggled, and the British had stepped in to save them. Montgomery, as always, was at the center of the story.
The reaction in America was explosive. American reporters who had attended Montgomery's press conference were quick to file their stories, and their tone was one of anger and disbelief. They highlighted Montgomery's arrogance and his repeated dismissal of American efforts during the Battle of the Bulge. One thing the reporters noticed again and again was Montgomery's constant use of the phrase, "I handled." It made it sound as if he alone had managed the entire battle, while American commanders and soldiers were merely bystanders. Within hours, newspapers across the United States were running editorials condemning Montgomery's press conference. The headlines and articles expressed shock, frustration, and even outrage. The timing and content of Montgomery's words seemed especially insulting to Americans. After all, American soldiers had been at the front lines for 6 grueling weeks, facing freezing winter conditions, heavy German attacks, and tremendous casualties. They had done the majority of the fighting and dying during the German offensive, and now Montgomery appeared to be claiming the credit for their hard work and sacrifices. Even military newspapers, like Stars and Stripes, were harsh in their criticism. Soldiers stationed in Europe, called GIs, read Montgomery's remarks and felt furious. These men had fought bravely in the Ardennes, held their positions against incredible odds, and in some cases, like at Bastogne, had been surrounded and under siege for days. They knew what they had endured, and they were angry to see a British general publicly taking credit for what they had accomplished. The American reaction was not just about wounded pride, it was about fairness and recognition. Soldiers, commanders, and reporters all felt that Montgomery's press conference minimized the role of the U.S. Army and elevated the British contribution at the expense of the Americans' heroic efforts. The words "I handled" became a symbol of what many Americans saw as an arrogant and misleading portrayal of the battle, turning what should have been a shared victory into a moment of controversy.
General Omar Bradley was sitting at his headquarters in Luxembourg when he read the news reports about Montgomery's press conference. Over the past 2 years, he had endured Montgomery's arrogance and condescending attitude. Montgomery had a habit of taking credit for successes, subtly criticizing others, and showing a barely concealed contempt for American commanders. Bradley had tolerated it, swallowed his pride, and tried to focus on the larger goal of defeating the Germans. He had even accepted the situation when Eisenhower temporarily placed American armies under Montgomery's command. That had felt like a personal insult, but Bradley had endured it for the sake of Allied unity. But this press conference was different. This was the final straw. Montgomery had publicly claimed credit for actions that were largely carried out by American soldiers and generals. He had minimized the American sacrifices and achievements in the Battle of the Bulge. Bradley could not ignore it. Furious and humiliated, he sat down at his desk and began to write out his resignation as commander of the 12th Army Group. He felt he could no longer serve under these conditions. He could not watch Montgomery take credit for American victories while dismissing the hard work, courage, and leadership of U.S. forces. After writing the resignation, Bradley called a meeting with his senior staff. He explained his decision and why he felt he could not continue in his role. His chief of staff immediately supported him, understanding the seriousness of the situation. Several of his army commanders also agreed. They believed that if Bradley resigned in protest over Montgomery's press conference, they would have to follow his lead. Multiple senior American generals might resign alongside him, which could create a major crisis for the Allied command structure in Europe. The situation was tense. Bradley's outrage reflected more than personal pride. It was about respect for the soldiers under his command and for the American role in the war.
His planned resignation was not just an emotional reaction, it was a statement that the accomplishments of the U.S. Army could not be ignored or overshadowed, no matter how celebrated a British general might be at home.
When General Dwight Eisenhower learned that General Omar Bradley was preparing to resign, he realized he was facing the most serious crisis of his command in Europe. Bradley's resignation was not just a personal matter, it had the potential to become a full-blown political disaster. If Bradley stepped down, it could trigger a massive crisis between the United States and Britain. Congress in Washington would demand hearings and investigations. The American public, already deeply invested in the war, would be furious. And most importantly, the carefully maintained alliance between the British and American commanders could be seriously damaged or even collapse. Eisenhower acted quickly. He called Bradley personally and asked him to hold off on submitting his resignation. He explained that he understood Bradley's frustration and promised that he would address the situation with Montgomery. Eisenhower assured him that a solution would be found and that the issue would be made right. Bradley, still angry but trusting Eisenhower's judgment, agreed to wait for 48 hours before taking any further action. After speaking with Bradley, Eisenhower immediately called Montgomery. The conversation was tense and serious. Eisenhower explained that Montgomery's press conference had created a firestorm of criticism in the United States. American generals were furious. Reporters had blasted Montgomery in their stories, and soldiers in the field were outraged. The alliance between the British and American commanders was at risk, and the entire Allied command structure in Europe was on the verge of collapse if the situation was not resolved quickly. Eisenhower had to find a way to calm the anger, restore trust, and preserve the alliance while maintaining the cooperation of both British and American commanders. It was a delicate balancing act. One wrong move, one poorly handled word could create permanent damage to the relationship between the two nations' armies and jeopardize the ongoing war effort in Europe.
Montgomery was genuinely surprised by the angry reaction to his press conference. He seemed almost confused and could not understand why people were so upset. From his perspective, he had been trying to praise the American soldiers. He had described the battle as a fine Allied picture and called it a great victory. In his mind, he was recognizing the success of the Allies, not criticizing anyone. So why was everyone so angry? Eisenhower tried to explain the situation carefully. He told Montgomery that it wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. The constant emphasis on the phrase, "I handled," made it sound as if Montgomery alone had been responsible for organizing the battle. To American commanders, this implied that they had been unable to manage the situation without British assistance. Eisenhower also pointed out Montgomery's dismissive treatment of Patton's achievements. Patton had performed one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history to relieve Bastogne, yet Montgomery barely acknowledged it. All of these details, the tone, the choice of words, and the minimal recognition of American efforts added up to an insult that the American commanders could not tolerate. Even after Eisenhower explained all of this, Montgomery still did not fully grasp the seriousness of what had happened. He reluctantly agreed to issue a clarification, but he did not think it was really necessary. In his view, the Americans were overreacting. He felt their response was too sensitive and politically motivated. Montgomery believed he had been fair and accurate, and he could not understand why his words had caused such a crisis between the British and American forces. Winston Churchill immediately understood the seriousness of the crisis caused by Montgomery's press conference. Churchill had spent years carefully building and maintaining the alliance between Britain and the United States. He knew that American support was absolutely essential for Britain's survival in the war. If relations between the two countries were damaged, even temporarily, it could have long-lasting consequences for the war effort. Churchill realized that Montgomery's statements, which seemed to take credit away from the Americans, had created a dangerous political situation that needed urgent attention. On January 18, 1945, Churchill addressed the House of Commons.
He had prepared his speech very carefully, knowing that every word would be closely read and analyzed not just by the British, but also by the American press and government. His goal was to repair the damage Montgomery had done and restore confidence in the Anglo-American partnership. In his speech, Churchill praised American leadership in the Battle of the Bulge extensively. He made it clear that the battle had been overwhelmingly an American fight. He emphasized the courage, skill, and determination of American soldiers who had fought through terrible winter conditions and against a determined German offensive. Churchill also highlighted the critical roles of General Dwight Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley, making sure that their contributions were fully recognized. At the same time, Churchill carefully explained that Montgomery's role had been supportive and temporary. Montgomery had helped in the northern sector, but the Americans had been the ones who bore the main burden of the battle. By framing it this way, Churchill reassured both the American public and military leaders that their efforts were being honored and that the alliance between the United States and Britain remained strong. Churchill's speech was a masterful political move. It acknowledged the achievements of the Americans, corrected any misconceptions caused by Montgomery's statements, and calmed the tensions that had been rising between the two Allied nations. By doing so, Churchill preserved the unity of the Allied command at a critical moment in the war, preventing what could have become a dangerous and prolonged rift.
In his carefully prepared speech to the House of Commons, Winston Churchill made sure to highlight the overwhelming role that American forces had played in the Battle of the Bulge. He said, "The Americans have engaged 30 or 40 men for every one we have engaged, and they had lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours." Churchill wanted everyone to understand this point clearly. The United States troops had done almost all the fighting and had suffered almost all the losses during the battle. He continued, explaining the human cost of the battle and why it was so important to recognize American efforts. Churchill said, "I never hesitate to stand up for our own soldiers when their achievements have been cold-shouldered or neglected or overshadowed, as they sometimes are. But we must not forget that it is to American homes that the telegrams of personal loss and anxiety have been going during these last few weeks." In other words, he reminded everyone that while British soldiers had fought bravely, the Americans had carried the heaviest burden. Families in the United States had been receiving news of deaths, injuries, and hardships, and Churchill wanted to make sure their sacrifices were acknowledged. Churchill's speech was a masterful example of diplomacy. He praised Montgomery briefly, acknowledging his role in the battle, but he spent most of the time emphasizing the sacrifices, bravery, and leadership of American soldiers and commanders. He made it clear that Britain fully appreciated and respected the contributions of the United States. The message was unmistakable. Churchill was sending a signal to both the American public and military leaders. The United States had fought and suffered heroically, and their efforts were not being overlooked. At the same time, he was carefully maintaining the alliance, balancing recognition of British contributions with a strong emphasis on American achievements. In doing so, Churchill repaired some of the damage caused by Montgomery's press conference and reassured both nations that the Anglo-American partnership remained strong and united.
On January 21, 1945, Field Marshal Montgomery finally issued a public clarification about his controversial press conference. It was not really an apology. Montgomery was not the type to admit wrongdoing easily, but more of an explanation of what he claimed he had meant to say. He wanted to reassure everyone that he respected American soldiers and their commanders. In the clarification, Montgomery emphasized that he had always had the greatest admiration for American troops and leaders. He praised their courage, their skill, and their resilience during the Battle of the Bulge. However, even while trying to clarify, Montgomery could not resist putting himself at the center of the story. He wrote that he was absolutely devoted to Ike and described Eisenhower as one of the great Allied leaders of this war. The phrasing of Montgomery's clarification revealed more than he likely intended.
To many American commanders, it suggested that Montgomery saw himself as Eisenhower's equal, or perhaps even superior, rather than as his subordinate. It reinforced the impression that Montgomery continued to view the battle through a lens that highlighted his own importance and achievements above all others. When American generals read Montgomery's clarification, they were not satisfied. They knew that he still did not fully understand the offense he had caused. In Montgomery's mind, he had saved the Americans in the Battle of the Bulge, and he had not recognized how dismissive and insulting his original press conference had appeared to them. The clarification did little to soothe tensions, leaving lingering resentment and a reminder that the rift between British and American commanders was far from resolved. The effects of Montgomery's press conference lasted not just for weeks, but for the rest of the war and even beyond. The damage it caused was deep and long-lasting. American generals who had once merely tolerated Montgomery now actively disliked him. General Omar Bradley, in particular, refused to be in the same room with Montgomery unless Eisenhower was present to mediate any interaction. General George Patton, never one to hide his opinions, turned Montgomery into a running joke. Soldiers in American mess halls across Europe would tell stories and make jokes about British caution, arrogance, and Monty's tendency to take credit for everything. The atmosphere between the British and American forces had changed. While the alliance survived, it was no longer as smooth and easy as it had been in earlier campaigns. Cooperation continued, but it became formal, careful, and politically cautious. American commanders were more sensitive to British criticism, while British leaders became more careful about what they said publicly. Montgomery himself, however, never fully understood the damage he had caused. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote about the Battle of the Bulge as if his role had been the decisive factor. He genuinely believed that he had saved the Americans from disaster. To him, the angry reaction to his press conference was simply a case of American oversensitivity and political manipulation. He could not see how his words had insulted the soldiers and commanders who had endured 6 brutal weeks in the Ardennes. The press conference left a permanent scar on the Anglo-American relationship. Even though the alliance held, the ease of earlier years, when British and American commanders worked together almost instinctively, was gone. In its place was careful diplomacy, guarded statements, and a lingering wariness on both sides. Montgomery's confidence in his own importance remained undiminished, while the Americans never forgot the insult. The Battle of the Bulge had been won, but the events surrounding the press conference ensured that tensions and resentment would continue for the remainder of the war. After Churchill's speech and Montgomery's clarification, Eisenhower returned to General Omar Bradley to address the crisis directly. He explained to Bradley that he had done everything possible to repair the damage caused by Montgomery's press conference. He assured Bradley that steps were being taken to recognize the achievements of American soldiers and commanders, and to maintain the balance of authority within the Allied command. Eisenhower then asked Bradley to withdraw his resignation for the sake of Allied unity and the ongoing fight to defeat Germany. He reminded Bradley how crucial it was to keep the American and British forces working together, especially with the war still raging in Europe. Bradley listened carefully, but he was not willing to step back unless there were guarantees that the situation that had caused this crisis would never happen again. Bradley finally agreed to stay in his position, but only after Eisenhower promised that Montgomery would never again command American forces except in the most extreme emergency. Eisenhower gave that promise, and from that moment forward, Montgomery's authority would be limited to British and Canadian forces. American armies would remain under American commanders unless absolutely necessary, preventing another situation like the one that had sparked the near resignation. Bradley also demanded that Eisenhower maintain personal command of the Allied offensive into Germany. He wanted no more temporary arrangements that gave Montgomery expanded authority over American forces.
Eisenhower agreed to this as well, recognizing that it was essential to preserve trust and ensure smooth coordination between the Allies. With these promises in place, the immediate crisis was resolved. The Anglo-American alliance remained intact, and Bradley stayed in command of the 12th Army Group. Montgomery retained his reputation at home, but his authority over American troops was firmly curtailed. The balance of leadership between the British and American commanders was restored, ensuring that the final push into Germany would proceed under a clear and stable chain of command.
History has not been kind to Montgomery's claims about the Battle of the Bulge. While he did perform competent work in commanding the northern sector, modern historians now recognize that the battle was won primarily by American forces. It was the American soldiers who held the line during the initial German assault. It was the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and under siege at Bastogne, who stood firm against overwhelming odds. And it was General George Patton, with his dramatic and rapid maneuver to relieve Bastogne, whose actions turned the tide of the battle. These were the real decisive factors that stopped the German offensive. Montgomery's contribution, while competent, was largely organizational and defensive. He helped to stabilize a chaotic situation, coordinate positions, and manage reserves in the northern sector, but he did not save the Americans from disaster. The soldiers themselves, through courage, determination, and effective leadership, saved their own positions. Allied air power, once the weather cleared, also played a critical role in halting the German advance. The British forces that Montgomery deployed into the battle arrived after the most critical moments had passed. They fought well in the later stages of the battle, but they were not the decisive element that Montgomery claimed in his press conference. His role has often been overstated, both at the time and in his own memoirs. The real story of the Battle of the Bulge is one of American endurance, leadership, and heroism, with Montgomery's efforts providing support, but not determining the outcome.
Montgomery's press conference is important not just for what it said about the Battle of the Bulge, but because it revealed a deeper underlying tension in the Anglo-American alliance. The British had been fighting since 1939. They had experienced armies, professional generals, and leaders who had learned their craft in campaigns across North Africa and Italy. From their perspective, they sometimes saw the Americans as brave and energetic, but also inexperienced and amateurish in comparison to long-tested British forces. The Americans, on the other hand, had enormous resources, fresh armies, and were supplying most of the men, equipment, and material necessary for the final push into Germany. They had helped keep the Allies in the fight. As a result, American commanders and soldiers resented being treated as junior partners by allies who, without American support, could not have continued the war. Montgomery's press conference brought these tensions into the open in the worst possible way. His words and tone confirmed every American's suspicion about British arrogance and condescension. By focusing on himself and the British role, minimizing American efforts, and failing to recognize the sacrifices and heroism of U.S. forces, Montgomery inflamed feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface. His inability or unwillingness to understand the offense he had caused only made matters worse. The event became a symbol of the challenges of coalition warfare. It showed how pride, perspective, and public statements could strain even the closest of alliances. While the British and Americans would continue to fight together successfully, Montgomery's press conference left a permanent mark on their relationship, shaping attitudes and sensitivities for the remainder of the war. The crisis caused by Montgomery's press conference also showed just how difficult Eisenhower's job was as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. He had to manage multiple challenges at once. He needed to balance the competing national interests of Britain and the United States, handle the egos and ambitions of high-ranking generals, maintain unity in the alliance, and at the same time continue planning and executing the military campaign to defeat Germany.
When Montgomery's press conference sparked anger and resentment among American commanders and the public, Eisenhower was forced to step in to repair the situation. He had to calm tensions, reassure American leaders, and prevent the Anglo-American alliance from breaking apart at a critical moment in the war. He succeeded in doing so, but the resolution came with consequences. Eisenhower's promise to General Bradley that Montgomery would never again command American forces except in an extreme emergency limited his operational flexibility. He could no longer give Montgomery authority over American armies, even in situations where it might have made military sense. At the same time, Eisenhower needed to maintain American confidence in the command structure. He could not appear to be favoring Montgomery, the British general who had publicly insulted American forces, without risking further anger and distrust. This political reality influenced Eisenhower's military strategy for the remainder of the war. The broad front strategy he pursued in 1945, advancing steadily across multiple sectors rather than concentrating a single powerful thrust toward Berlin, was shaped in part by the need to balance political sensitivities and maintain unity among the Allies. Montgomery, who had favored a focused single attack to reach Berlin, was denied that opportunity because Eisenhower could not risk appearing to reward a general who had caused such controversy. In other words, the fallout from Montgomery's press conference did more than create temporary tension. It had lasting effects on how the final Allied offensives were conducted, showing how politics and personal rivalries could influence military decisions at the highest levels. Eisenhower had to be both a general and a diplomat, keeping the alliance intact while still winning the war.
The final irony of Montgomery's press conference is that it achieved almost the exact opposite of what he intended. His goal had been simple, or so he thought. He wanted to give credit to British forces for their role in the Battle of the Bulge. He wanted the British public to see that their armies and generals were still vital to the Allied war effort. He also wanted to enhance his own reputation as a great and decisive general. Instead, the results were disastrous. Rather than elevating British contributions, Montgomery's words made them seem minimal or unnecessary in the eyes of the Americans. His press conference convinced American generals and soldiers that he was arrogant, tone-deaf, and untrustworthy. It alienated the very allies he depended on. Far from proving that British leadership was essential, he guaranteed that British influence over American forces would be curtailed for the remainder of the war. All of this happened in less than an hour on January 7, 1945. In that brief time, Montgomery nearly brought the Allied command structure to the brink of collapse. He turned American generals permanently against him. He forced Winston Churchill to spend valuable political capital in the House of Commons repairing the damage. He limited his own authority, ensuring that for the rest of the war he would command only British and Canadian forces and would never again have direct authority over American armies except in extreme emergencies. Montgomery's failure was not just a matter of pride or ego. It came down to a simple truth. He could not give credit gracefully, he could not downplay his own role, and he could not understand how his words would sound to exhausted American soldiers and commanders who had just survived the largest and bloodiest battle their army had ever fought. The press conference is now remembered as a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that in war, as in any human endeavor, how you say something matters just as much as what you say. Leadership is not only about skill and planning, it is also about understanding people, reading the room, and giving credit where it is due. Sometimes the wisest course of action is simply to stay quiet and let others be recognized. Montgomery never learned that lesson. On that day in January 1945, his inability to understand basic human psychology almost cost the Allies their unity at the moment they needed it most.